This is Sam Black, and this week I'm doing something a little unusual. I'm going to be discussing the Arena Cube, kind of a big picture sense, not looking at any particular archetypes really. The reason I'm doing this is that there is an Arena Cube open this coming weekend, and we're kind of between sets. Interest in Lord of the Rings is tapering off as we start to get ready for Wild's Drain, and we don't really have full spoilers out for Wild's Drain, so this week I'm talking about the Arena Cube, and then next week I should be able to take an early look at Wild's Drain. So that's what we're doing here. As always, notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. I don't usually like to lean too much on 17 lands stats for cubes. The whole thing is just pretty different when you don't have commons and every card is equally rare, and cards are kind of designed to fit in pretty different strategies, and the different strategies are differently straightforward to draft, differently common to draft. You can't really control for when cards are played in good or bad contexts very easily. The format's kind of a little bit more complicated and varied and nuanced in a way that doesn't lend itself super well to 17 land stats, especially for individual cards. But since this cube hasn't been out for very long, I don't have a ton of personal experience to draw from. So instead, I spent some time looking over 17 lands to figure out, what utility I could find, and I thought I would present that as best I can here. So I started by opening recent trophy decks on 17 lands to get a sense of what's doing well, and when I did that, the top 12 decks were all white. A vast majority of them were white-red, usually not very many colors, 1 to 3, maybe 2 on average, and none of them were green. So as I scrolled down, there was a wider range of decks. It wasn't just all white all the time, but it was still the case that in general, red, white, and blue seemed to trophy appreciably more often than green and black, and then that kind of bore out in the play rates and win rates for the cards grouped by color. Red is the most played color, I assess, based on looking at just how many games played each red card has compared to how many games played the other cards have. So it seems like people play red more often, blue and white comparable to each other and behind that, and then green and black comparable to each other and significantly behind blue and white. So that's kind of what's going on big picture in terms of which colors people default to or are drawn to in this cube. And then from there, I kind of just looked at each color individually to see what trends existed in each color. So something I got to late that I kind of want to start with because it's an important disclaimer. When I got to green, Llanowar Visionary was the top green common by a lot. Llanowar Visionary is a good card, does basically what you're looking for. Surprised to see it 2% ahead of the next best card, but whatever. Llanowar Visionary, very good. That's the 3-mana 2/2 that taps for a green and draws a card when it enters. But what I wanted to point out is that Llanowar Elves perform 3% better, have a 3% higher game in hand win rate than Elvish Mystic. These are the same card. There's literally no gameplay difference between Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic, but Llanowar Elves wins 3% more, and Llanowar Elves has a 6.7% improvement when drawn, compared to Elvish Mystic's 1%. If I were looking at any other two cards and there was a 3% difference in game and hand win rate and a almost 6% difference in improvement when drawn, I would assume that these were significantly different cards and that one was appreciably better than the other. The fact that they are the same card and have these stats should really serve to highlight just how much variance there is in these stats. 3% is really a lot in the context of how wide the range is on cards in general. So really highlights the extent to which, especially early on with these small sample sizes, a lot of this is just mythologizing and making narratives about random numbers. So that's just something to keep in mind. That is to say, anytime I'm getting into the nuances of like which cards perform better based on the stats than the others, take it with a big grain of salt. I looked at trends because it's what I have to work with, but yeah, keep that in mind. So in white, Benelish Knight Counselor. This is an arena only card. It's a 2-1 for 1 with enlist that like pumps up another guy that you play. It's the best performing white common. It has a relatively weak improvement when drawn and not the highest play rate. The low improvement when drawn is because it's the kind of card that's going to be bad in long games. I suspect that like this card's stats being exceptional say a lot less about how good this actual card is, and I think what's really happening is this is a card that you really only play in aggressive white decks, and it performing well among white cards suggests that aggressive white decks probably perform well among white decks. So while I think that, the win rates for individual cards against each other should be taken with a large grain of salt, seeing a card that's not played very much but clearly points to a particular deck as like where its stats are coming from does suggest something. And that suggestion to take a step out and look at this in a bigger picture does make a lot of sense in this cube. Specifically, the reason that I think that white aggressive decks and really aggressive decks in a whole do well is that this cube has an exceptionally high number of counter spells. I believe when I counted, if I didn't miscount, there are 18 blue cards that can counter spells. That's a lot. A lot of them are good. A lot of the top performing blue cards that I'll get to soon are counter spells. And there being that many counterspells in the format is very punishing to cards that cost more mana in general. A lot of the trophy winning decks are decks that just have tons of 2-drops and then a lower curve after that. Not all of them, but I think that that's generally a good way to approach this cube, is just to like have a low curve to get under the counter spells. And then the decks that are going to succeed, especially early, are the decks that just kind of naturally do that, which are the aggressive decks. And so makes sense to me that especially early when people aren't necessarily used to like how to adjust other like decks with more expensive spells to a very counterspell heavy metagame, that just kind of the like low to the ground decks are going to perform well, kind of like preying on these blue decks. So Benelish Knight, Counselor, top performing white common. The Wandering Emperor and Elish Norn Grand Cenobite are next. I think both those cards are just really strong. Elish Norn Grand Cenobite notably also is played relatively little, like Benelish Knight Counselor, but presumably in almost exclusively non-overlapping decks. Elish Norn Grand Cenobite, that's the 7-mana Elish Norn that gives your creatures +2/+2 and your opposing creatures -2/-2. Is like a really strong card, but it doesn't fit in very many decks because not all that many white decks are looking to play 7-mana spells. But it is super high impact when you resolve it. It's a strong card. It just doesn't go in that many decks. Wandering Emperor is versatile and goes in basically every white deck, and it's just a really, really strong card. Thraben Inspector and Adanto Vanguard stand out as cards that people play frequently but don't have really good win rates. I'm still a Thraben Inspector fan, but it is what it is. I would suspect that Thraben Inspector is less punishing to the blue decks than other early creatures, and that Adanto Vanguard isn't very good in an aggressive metagame where like both people are aggressive. It's better against decks that are like trying to block or play removal. And so both of those cards might only be good against a portion of the metagame rather than good against everyone, which might account for both of them having lower aggregate stats. Other notable stats: Welcoming Vampire, the 2/3 that draws a card when you play a small creature, underperforms. So do Loran of the Third Path and Emiria's Call. March of Otherworldly Light and Touch the Spirit Realm are worse. Other cards that don't perform well: Settle the Wreckage, Charming Prince, Seal Away, Elish Norn, the 4-mana one, Rabble Rousing, Kenrith. I don't know exactly what you should do with a random list of cards that don't do well, but there you have it. I guess I would say it's kind of some like mid-range type stuff. Airing a little bit more controlling, generally lacking focus, suggests that the white decks really perform best in aggregate with like a focused, aggressive plan. Big winners: Restoration of Iganjo, Soon's Intervention, Archangel Elspeth, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Dauntless Bodyguard, and Giver of Runes. Big winners here meaning cards that have relatively high win rates to how frequently they're played. So these are like overperformers. Restoration of Iganjo kind of argues against what I was saying about like focused aggressive being the only way to go with white. I think of that as kind of a structurally similar card to Welcoming Vampire, but it's nice that it gives you like guaranteed value more than Welcoming Vampire does. Soon's Intervention has just always been fantastic. That's the 6 mana instant with a bunch of modes. Archangel Elspeth, I wasn't expecting to be as good as it is. Thalia beating up on blue decks makes total sense to me. And then Dauntless Bodyguard and Giver of Runes are just other good aggressive white creatures, so that's pretty coherent. Blue, the top performing card by a lot is Censor. Little unexpected to me that it does like several percent better than Counterspell, but again, several percent might not mean anything. Another bigger surprise, the second best performing blue card is Frost Titan. Frost Titan is not a card that I think gets a lot of respect. I am among the people who don't give it a lot of respect. It doesn't have a lot of games played, but it has enough to have an impressive win rate relative to other blue commons. But again, I would take that number in particular with a very large grain of salt, as I suspect that its sample size is like just big enough to give it stats at all. Counterspells and flash creatures perform well and make up like all of the rest of Blue's top commons. It's just a list of alternating or, well, a group of counterspells. Maybe it's some flash creatures that play well with counterspells. It's really just all of that. Worst performing cards: Champion of Wits, The Modern Age, Search for Ascanta, Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, which is noteworthy since it did pretty well for me yesterday, though certainly there are some games that I've played where it's just bad and doesn't really do anything. There are other games where it dominates. High variance card, that's the Teferi that gets loyalty whenever you draw cards and can make 2/2s that get bigger when you draw cards. Baral's Expertise, Absorb Energy, the most cancel type card in the format. It's cancel, but your cards in hand get cheaper if they share a type with the thing that you canceled. And God Eternal Kefnet, this is ignoring cards that don't have stats. Most overplayed card that people play a lot that doesn't have great stats: Chrome Host Seed Shark. So maybe cool off on that one a little bit. And most underplayed is apparently Frost Titan. People don't play it much, and it has crazy stats at the moment. But yeah, the main takeaway from Blue is just how many counterspells there are and the extent to which I think that makes you really want to play a low curve in general. Top performing black card is Undercity Plunder. That's an arena-only card, 2 mana. Your opponent discards a card, and then they choose whether they give you a copy of a card in their hand or discard another card. And then Shieldred, not Shieldred the Apocalypse, the 5 mana Shieldred, then Breach the Multiverse, then Shieldred the Apocalypse, and then Deadly Dispute. The worst performing black cards, ignoring those with insufficient data: Invasion of Fiora, the 6 mana Wrath, Morbid Opportunist, Unburial Rites, Collective Brutality, Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, Fran, Executioner Thane, and Black Sun's Twilight. Overplayed cards: Gonti, Valky, Murderous Rider. Underplayed cards: Gutterbones, Shambling Ghast, Deadly Dispute. Those cards performing well and not being played very much, it makes sense that those cards aren't played very much because they go in one specific kind of black deck. The fact that they all have good stats suggests that like small creature sacrifice package that doesn't go in every black deck is performing relatively well. That kind of makes sense. It's the low curve black deck. It's like black doesn't have a very good like actual aggro deck, but it does have a pocket of cheap cards that play well with other cheap cards, and it would make sense to me that like those would do well in the counterspell format. Again, black as a whole doesn't do super well and isn't very played. I would say this cube is not very black friendly, and I think that it makes sense to somewhat avoid black. I think that black can like sometimes struggle with aggressive decks, especially aggressive red decks. And I think that like the black mid-range decks can have a problem with the counter spells, and then the black like fast decks, yeah, I think they are just like not great against the red fast decks, and red's the most played thing, so it's kind of awkward there. That said, I think that if you find good synergies in the like low curve black space, the fact that black is underdrafted means that you can, get a good version of that deck. Red, the most played color, top performing cards are Phoenix of Ash, Fanatical Firebrand, that's the 1/1 haste that taps and sacrifices to do a damage to anything. Rada's Firebrand, that's the 3/1 that can stop things from blocking for 2 with the, like a domain pump ability. Kumano faces Kakazan. Inferno Titan, Seasoned Pyromancer, Lightning Bolt, and Fable the Mirror Breaker, and Hellrider. Notably, all of the cards ahead of Lightning Bolt are not played very often, even Seasoned Pyromancer. And so their higher win rate, it largely, I think, suggests the serious, like, aggro red deck does well and likes those cards. Lightning Bolt and Fable the Mirror Breaker are the most played cards and are very good. But I think that, like Lightning Bolt and Fable are probably better cards that you should take over those other cards, even though the other cards have higher win rates. The other cards, I think, are mostly just showing that, like, mono red and red white aggro decks are doing well, and those show up in them. The worst performing cards in red are Dragon Master Outcast, the 1/1 that makes dragons if you have 6 lands, Big Score, Magmatic Channeler, Invasion of Mercadia, Light Up the Stage, Fight with Fire, Brotherhood's End. Yeah, Abrade has strikingly bad stats. Like, looking at cards that stand out as having bad stats for how often they're played, really Abrade is like the only one that stands out. Abrade and Volcanic Spite are the two that I noted as having poor stats for their play rate, with Abrade really being more exceptional. And then underplayed Fanatical Firebrand, the Elder Dragon War, and Zealous Conscripts all have like good stats for how often they're played. I assume that the relatively poor performance of removal that can't target players suggests that red usually performs best in aggressive decks, and that like those cards, I don't know if they're struggling because people are playing them in decks that are like not base red and looking to shore up a longer game plan with some early red removal, or if it's that they're weaker in like the aggressive red decks, or both. I suspect probably both. I don't think that means that you shouldn't play Abrade or Volcanic Spite in your like mid-range and control decks. I think that they are good removal spells for those decks. It just suggests that those decks don't perform in aggregate as well as like the aggressive red decks. And so those cards have lower win rates than other red cards. With all this stuff, remember that the cards' win rates suggests a lot more about how much decks that play them win and how well they play in those decks, rather than like whether it is ever correct to play the cards. So green, as I mentioned before, Llanowar Visionary is the best performing card, followed by Nissa Who Shakes the World, Essica's Chariot, Kagla the Titan Ape, Llanowar Elves, and Avacyn's Pilgrim, but obviously not Elvish Mystic, for very good reasons that are entirely related to the relative strength of those two cards. I would say that green's cards that perform well in aggregate suggest that you want to play some ramp into planeswalkers or other cards that kind of generate immediate value. So creatures and artifacts in Essica's Chariot's case with like good enter the battlefield abilities. And green's bottom performing cards, Toski, Bearer of Secrets, Timeless Witness, Essica, God of the Trees, Terra Sunder, Ovenwald Oddity, Augur of Autumn, and Briarbridge Tracker, suggesting that kind of the green, like mid-range value place that I kind of enjoy playing doesn't do very well here. That's not terribly surprising. Those kind of like mid-range multicolor green decks really struggle with a bunch of counter spells and can certainly end up, you know, behind against the aggressive decks if they don't have like dedicated cards that are like there for that matchup. And the more of those like anti-aggro cards you play, the worse your like counterspell matchups get. So kind of an awkward squeeze for the mid-range green decks that aren't just like proactive like big aggro ramp decks, which is where I think green wants to try to end up. Multicolor, top performing cards: Prismari Command, Maelstrom Pulse, Blood Tithe Harvester, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and Crucius, Titan of Waves. Maelstrom Pulse performing particularly well is surprising to me. Outside of that, I'm not really sure what the takeaway from this is. The worst performing cards are 5 mana Tatioba, Fiend Artisan, 3 mana Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, the one that's played in Mono Green Devotion Pioneer, Anguished Unmaking, and older Raven Guard Marshal. Those cards just aren't very good, so not too surprising, I suppose. Didn't try to like glean a whole lot from multicolor outside of just kind of glancing at which cards perform well and poorly overall. Top performing colorless card, Bomat Courier. Read into that exactly what you would expect. Red does better than colorless, so Bomat Courier is basically like a red card. And then Mutavault, Retrofitter Foundry, Den of the Bugbear, Sky Sovereign, Guardian Idol, and Mindstone. So aggressive red cards, Retrofitter Foundry, Mutavault being a good aggressive land makes total sense to see it up there. Sky Sovereign's generally pretty strong, and then the 2 mana ramp is good, kind of course, but the nature of the cube could call that into question, I suppose. Bottom performing, Field of Ruin, Field of the Dead, and Ulamog's Ceaseless Hunger. Field of the Dead being one of the bottom performing cards is certainly noteworthy. Field of the Dead is very strong. If you are in the Field of the Dead deck, you do want Field of the Dead. That is to say, if you're playing, like a multicolor deck with a bunch of different non-basic lands, and then Field of the Dead is going to make your deck better, I believe. But that kind of deck does really struggle between the pressures of early aggression and cheap counter spells. So, conclusion, to the extent that I have one, when in doubt, lean toward white or red aggro or blue with a lot of counter spells. If you're an aggressive player, you should probably just be taking white and or red aggressive cards. If you are a control player, just start by taking blue counter spells and then figure out your support color if you have one. Playing decks with higher curves and more colors is risky. I'm in danger. And like it can be particularly hard for other decks to be well set up against both the aggressive creatures and the counter spells. So if you're trying to play a different deck, make sure that you really understand how to draft that deck such that it has a plan against those things in particular. So that's kind of what I was able to get from the stats, and lines up reasonably well with my experience. I do think that, like, as far as defining characteristics of this cube uniquely, I think that red aggressive decks performing well in the Arena cube is certainly nothing new, but I think this cube is really largely defined, or at least constrained by the large number of counter spells in the cube. So that's what I have, and now I'd like to turn it over to chat for questions and discussion. Also, usual reminder that patreon.com/drafting archetypes is the most direct way to support this podcast, if that's something you're invested in doing. And if you'd like to support the podcast another way, leaving reviews and suggesting it to friends or tweeting about things that you've found interesting from it are all great avenues to promote the podcast. All right, so questions. Thoughts on the 4-mana counters like Dismiss and Kindred Denial? I like Dismiss more than Kindred Denial because it doesn't really miss. Like Kindred Denial, sometimes you'll counter something and you won't have a thing of the appropriate cost. I like both of them. I do think that they're worse than like the 2-mana counter spells, or at least the 2-mana hard counters or counters that are good against every deck, like Counterspell and Censor, and maybe arguably Make Disappear. But I think that they are cards that I'm generally happy to play. Which companions have I had the most success with? Lutri is the companion that I've played as a companion. Lutri is good. The last time I tried playing Lurrus in an arena cube, I had some problems. It has been good other times, but it felt risky. Gigantha generally feels like it costs way too much in terms of card quality. Yorion, I think also generally costs too much in terms of card quality. Karuga seems like it would be an absolute disaster in this cube. I think that's what I have to say about companions. Notice that blue-white, blue-green, and blue-red are the highest win rate color pairs in best of one. Would this suggest that more controlling decks are doing better? Because even in best of one, they're higher win rate. I think that blue is just really good in this cube because the counter spells are so good, and red being overdrafted, and then I mean it is certainly, it would not surprise me if the best place to be in general is a blue deck. I think that the like red and white aggro decks dangerous to like reliably try to be, because I think that like they don't necessarily pivot out well if other people in your pod are trying to do the same thing. Whereas I think that like the multicolor blue decks can kind of cooperate with other draft or navigate having other drafters in some of their colors a little more safely. But I don't know a lot more than that about it. I've been having a lot of success in best of 3 with blue-black control. That makes sense to me. Usually I find my way there after starting blue and picking Languish or Extinction Event. Would you say that's a good approach, or should I keep open and not pick a sweeper and force myself into blue-black? I have found that I like Extinction Event more than Languish. I haven't found the sweepers to be all that crucial or hard to find, I guess. And if your goal is blue plus sweeper, you can do it in blue red or blue black instead, or blue white instead. I think that in general, the strategy start with like blue cards that trade up on mana and then figure out what support is open while expecting to be a control deck and looking for support that's going to specifically hedge against aggressive decks is a coherent approach to this cube. Are there resources that you find specifically useful for adapting to the aggressive meta when trying to draft more value-oriented decks? Cheap removal and good defensive creatures like Blade Splicer and Refractor Mage, whatever, the 3-mana bounce guy that I can't believe I don't know the exact name of right now. Thraben Inspector, Blade Splicer, like any of those kind of like value creature, Reflector Mage. And then the mono blue Flash Reflector Mage, the Bouncer, that guy's really good. Just in general, like defensive creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities are generally going to line up well against aggressive decks. Is it true that you should draft cheaper cards to cover 4, 5, and 6 drops no matter the deck? Oh, over. Cheaper drafts over 4, 5, and 6 drops no matter the deck. I mean, there are exceptions, right? There are 4, 5, and 6 mana spells that are just like disproportionately good. But I would say, like, when in doubt, this cube rewards taking the cheaper card, such that like if your experience in other cubes is that there are two cards that you like about as much, in this cube in particular, the one that is cheaper is probably going to be better. Am I pack one, pick one, taking the end gamers like Atali and Emrakul, or valuing low and Breach, or valuing low curve stuff more? Um, so some of the like curve topper type stuff is exceptionally good. Like Breach is a strong card, and I could see starting with that over, if it's a weak pack and there aren't really any standouts lower on the curve, and then you like have that end game that that you're drafting toward. But I do think that, a lot of the time you'd be better off. I think that I usually want to first pick a like really flexible card that's going to be good anywhere, something like Cold Cold Steel Heart, Lightning Bolt, Swords to Plowshares, Counterspell, a card that's just efficient and gonna like trade up on mana and not lock me into a particular strategy. It's my approach personally. I think there are other people who know that they want to draft an aggressive deck, and then they're more likely to just take the good aggressive card, or know that they like to have some top end to build toward, and then might like take that like premium top end card. But for me, I think that the best you can do early is generally to just take versatile, strong cards. Recently listened to Lucky Paper Radio, where the guest mentioned that forcing archetypes is stronger in Cube than in retail draft. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that part of this is that there are more different decks in Cube, and so if there's a particular deck that you like, especially if it's not just like mono red aggro or mono white aggro, then there's a decent chance that the cards that you're looking for just aren't going to be the cards that other people are looking for. And so you can just like go in knowing these are the cards that I want and get them. Whereas like in regular like retail drafts, the archetypes are more just like color A plus color B, and being behind two red drafters is just going to mean that like you don't get to draft red or whatever. Whereas with a cube, a large portion of the cards are playable if you know which deck you want to put them in, and if if you know where you want to end up and you're like know how to prioritize the cards that are taken highly to be able to end up there, I think that it makes sense that forcing is a little easier to pull off. This should suggest that green would most likely be open. How should green decks look if so? I think that green wants to ramp. I think that like the 1 mana elves in particular are very good. And as I mentioned when I was just talking about the top performing cards, I think you want to be ramping into cards that aren't cleanly answered by a single removal spell. So planeswalkers and cards like Essica's Chariot that give you some kind of immediate value. The Groundbreaker guy that sacks land to make 2 factories is pretty good. I think that you don't want to go too big. I think that you want to just like, mostly be like ramping to 4 and 5 drops, and you want to like avoid some of the cards that really excel in like grindy interactive mid-range mirrors like Timeless Witness and Tireless Tracker and Briarbridge Tracker, and focus more on just kind of like slamming proactive haymakers in spots where you can like get a blue opponent to like tap out for something, and then play something that like they can't recover from very well. How many 2 mana removal spells are you looking to put in a control deck? I think that in red, I'm not looking to like super highly prioritize, especially the sorcery speed 2 mana removal spells. I like to have some. I also might undervalue them. It kind of feels like they're pretty important a lot of the time. Especially in best of 3, I definitely like to have access to a lot of them so that I can side them in against aggressive decks. Given that this is... So I should note that the data that I was looking at was for best of 1 draft because the sample sizes are large enough that it might mean something, whereas there's not a lot of data available in traditional draft. I do think that traditional draft is meaningfully different from best of one. I think that you really want to pay attention to prioritizing cards that line up really well against like certain subsets of decks. Like I think cards like Disdainful Stroke and Spell Pierce and any cheap removal and sweepers that have polarized matchups go from pretty bad as early picks in best of one to very good picks in best of three. I think being able to tune the interactive spells in your deck to line up well against your opponent is a very high priority in this Arena Cube in particular, because I think that the fact that you often should be playing fewer colors means that you don't need to prioritize lands, which means that you can afford to prioritize more spells and specifically more sideboard cards. And having a really good sideboard and being able to adjust to each individual matchup, I think, is going to be a very large factor in best of three matches with this Arena Cube Open in particular. So I do think that you really want to be trying to draft a deck and a sideboard in a very real way as kind of, I think, the most important thing to highlight for this Arena Open that might differ from your usual play on Arena if you're used to playing best of one and other Arena Cubes. And I really think that the importance of sideboarding in best of three in Cube really can't be overstated. I think that if you are someone who usually drafts best of one, and you're planning to put serious effort into the Cube Open, you should really try some best of three drafts and get used to, figuring out which those cards that you need access to and how to sideboard with them. And I think I'm going to wrap it up on that note. So thanks everyone for listening. Good luck to those of you who are playing with this cube in the Arena Open this weekend. And a reminder that next week we are going to start looking at Wilds of Eldraine, so it's exciting. And yeah, bye for now, and I'll be back next week with that Wilds of Eldraine first look. All right, bye everyone.
Prepare for light speed.